So what we're going to do in this exercise is take a look at painting a hair texture, a simple hair texture in GIMP. So the first thing we want to do is create our canvas. So File, New, make this 512 by 512 because it's going to be a game asset, and OK. Zoom in a little bit, make this easier to see. So what we need here is basically a paintbrush. So there's the paint tool that will give us a linear, let's change the color. So that's clicking on the sample that will create a linear pattern. So we've got our brush selections, and we can select any one of these and it will give us various patterns that we can use to paint lines or a linear pattern. So let's try this one. That's a good one. So let's go with this. So this is going to be our brush, and this is essentially all we need to do. We're literally doing it right now. This is painting hair. So let's just reset that layer or get rid of it. Delete, create a new layer. Transparency. OK. So we've got our layer, and all we need to do is paint our lines. And we don't have to worry too much about the appearance of these, because this being hair, we want it to be random. Let's change the tone. So that's our first layer. Let's change the tone. Color swatch. Let's make this a little mid-toned. Okay. Now we could paint straight over the top of this and do that. But a better approach is to create another layer so that we paint onto that, and what that would then mean is that we have greater flexibility in terms of making adjustments to the different layers or the different tones or colors that we assign to or we paint to our canvas. So if we wanted darker highlights, we could affect that layer, make it darker or lighter depending on the filters or the colors that we use. So new layer dialog again, transparency, everything else is okay. Okay, so our lighter gray, that's a mid gray. Okay, and we can just paint on this. Another layer for the highlights. Okay, let's make this a brighter tone, not quite white. We don't want to use white so much because that can blow out our texture. Another layer. Go back to black or a darker color. And let's make some adjustments to the brush, or alternatively, so we could ordinarily make some changes here, but what we can also do is just leave the brush as it is, and if we had painted these too heavily, we can use the layer and its opacity to change the apparent or the perceived strength of that layer. So we can change the contrast without necessarily repainting or making changes to the brush itself. One more layer. Okay. Go with black again. Let's make the brush slightly larger. 2, 5, 6. So that's now a big brush. Another layer, and we'll go with highlights. Again, we don't want to use white because we don't want to blow out the image. Change the opacity. And that is basically all we need to do. So we're using the paintbrush, making a brush selection that's going to give us a linear pattern over our image when we paint it to our layers. So if we're using layers, we're selecting our layer and painting specifically onto that with a specific color. So we are essentially separating the different tones. In this case, it's grayscale. And painting each tone to a layer so that we have control over the transparency of that layer. And then for the color, all we need to do again, new layer. Okay, that's gone down at the bottom. Let's just move that up to the top. So click drag. Let's just rename this color. Flood fill. Select our color. Let's go with a brownish, like so. Okay, fill. And then here we want to change the mode, which is basically the way the image or the layer that we've just filled, we're going to change the way that that blends with all the other layers. So normal, and it will likely be overlay, soft light, hard light. Oh, that's interesting. And we've got some gaps that we need to take care of. So that's exposed those gaps because we used a transparent layer rather than a color tinted layer. Usually it's white. So let's add a base layer, and we need to change the fill width from transparency to, let's just go with white. Okay. Grab that, move it down to the bottom. So now we've got our proper hair texture. So all those gaps are now filled essentially with the tone that we just dropped into our color layer. So if we want to add a highlight to this, we can do the same thing again, add a layer. We can make this transparent again. Okay, use our paintbrush. Same paintbrush. That's got our brown color that we added to our color layer. But we can use that. We can use the mode to change how that appears. To give us a highlight, or alternatively, let's hide that. New layer. Transparency, okay. Change the brush. We'll use white this time. Just paint some random pattern on there. Filters. What we can do here is blur it. So filters, Gaussian blur. Typically, there are other options for blurring, but Gaussian blur is usually typical. So filters, blur, Gaussian blur. We'll get the blur filter dialog. That's a bit too much. So click drag. Let's leave it at that so that we have some semblance of the striations from the brush stroke that we can utilize in the pattern. So okay. And then we'll use our blend modes. Let's try overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light. What about screen? Dodge, multiply. So each one of these will give us a slightly different highlight. So if we've got our highlight, but it's not quite highlighted enough, what we can do is just select the layer that we just created, duplicate, and it'll just increase the strength of the highlight. So we don't necessarily need to do anything complicated in terms of repainting or doing any more painting. All we need to do is just duplicate the layers. We could even change the blend mode to change the way the highlight appears. And that is literally a very simple way of creating a hair texture in GIMP. And of course, all we need to do now, because obviously what we've done is just ignored the orientation of the image and we've just relied on the orientation of the brush. So the orientation doesn't matter so much as all we need to be able to do is use our brush to paint our texture, because then obviously all we need to do then, once we've got all of that sorted out, is transform, rotate, and this will just rotate the image around. So image, transform, rotate the right way up, and that is our hair texture. Now, with it being a hair texture, generally speaking, we don't need to make this tile, but because the UVs are typically mapped one-to-one to our image, so if this was a hair front or a bang, we would just map that and stretch it down our image. But if we did need to make this tile, what we can do is either tile the entire image. Let's just save this before we do. So file, save as, texture, whoops, GIMP. Save that in the right location. Avatar. There we go. Save. So, if we needed this to tile, generally speaking, we don't with hair because of the highlight. We want to avoid tiling hair that's highlighted because the highlight creates a repetitious pattern that makes it obvious that the texture is tiling. But notwithstanding that, if we needed to tile this, we could do one of two things. We can either right click in the layers panel and just merge or flatten everything. So we can merge down, that's a specific layer, or we just flatten the image. Just going to flatten the image. That will give us a single layered image. And then for tiling, we want filters again, map, tile seamless. So filters, map, tile seamless. This will bring up the tile seamless filter dialog, and it will automatically modify the image so that it tiles. So we can see some areas that indicates that it's being tiled. And then we can test this. If we split the view, we can see the before and the after. And we can see the area where it's been tiled. And this will make sense if we just do a quick test. So cancel that. And what we mean by this is we can test this. So if you go into Layer, Transform, Offset, we can see what a tiling texture would look like if it hadn't been set up for tiling. So Offset. This is by pixels. So our image is 512. So let's do 256. 256. And we can see that absent the tiling correction, we get artifacts where the image tiles against itself. And this is why we use the tile seamless. Cancel that. So if we go back into filters, map, tile seamless, apply that, so OK, and then go back into layer, transform, offset, 256, 256. We can see that no matter what values we have in the offset, our image always tiles. But for hair with highlights, what we might want to do, cancel that, reopen the original. Actually, let's just save this file now that we've got it. Save as tiled. Save. Right, so if we open the original, if we wanted to tile this and avoid the repetitious pattern that becomes obvious because of the highlight, all we'd need to do is just remove the highlights, flatten the image, and then tile it. So now it's not quite so obvious. Let's OK that. Layer, transform, offset, 256 by 256. It's not quite as obvious that the image is being tiled. So when we're painting our hair textures, we need to be aware of how the texture is being used. If it's going to tile along the length of a mesh, we generally want to avoid adding highlights to it. Let's just cancel that and reset it back to what it was. Okay, save that, save as, no highlight, save. So when we're painting our textures, we need to be aware of how they are going to be used. If they are to be tiled, it's best to avoid adding highlights, because that exposes the fact that the image has been tiled. So we'll have to try and figure out a different way, little tricks that we can use to add highlights that would otherwise cause texture repetition. But with all of that said, that is basically all we need to do to paint hair texture in GIMP. And this is why we use the layers, because we can change the appearance of the hair on a macro level depending on how and what layers we've got active. So there we are. And obviously all we need to do then, once we've got everything set up, let's just re-enable all of these, It's just export. So File, Export, in the right place, text GIMP, PNG, Export. Defaults will be okay. Export. And that will produce a PNG that we can then use as a game asset.